Hey community, welcome back. And if this is your first time here, I'm Dr. Blaire, a doc in clinical psychology, and on this channel we discuss psychology, inspiration, social justice, and all topics in between. First things first, hit that subscribe and bell button. I need to see you back next week. And of course, stay tuned because we're going to continue our conversation around Black mental health. Keep watching. All right, so let's jump into it. Protecting the Black narrative. What exactly do I mean by that? And I know that we know what a narration or a narrative is, that storyline. And so when it comes to Black people, it is the exact same thing. So again, I'm going to be glancing down at notes as I usually do, just to make sure we go over some key points. But let's start off with history, because y'all already know I am a buffer for referring to history so we know what we're going to do moving forward, so we don't repeat those same cycles. When we look at Black history, we know that there were many barriers that really made it much more of a challenge to capture our history. What are those barriers? Well, at one point, we weren't allowed to read, weren't allowed to write. Therefore, we could not necessarily capture it in books the same way that other people were doing their history, or we couldn't do it at the same level of frequency. And so some people were able to break past those barriers and do that for us as a community. But for the most part, we really relied on folklores or passing down the stories by word of mouth. Now, there's a level of inaccuracy and accuracy that could come along with that, because we've all played that telephone game where we passed on the same message and somehow it ended up getting twisted and pulled in multiple directions by the end of the game. And I'm not necessarily saying that that has happened, but I'm saying it possibly could have happened if we have solely relied on folklores and telling our stories by mouth. And so when we capture it, it increases the likelihood of us capturing it in an accurate way. But when you cannot do that, or you have other people who are not within the community capturing it, it may not have been communicated in the same way that was intended. Right? So this was a barrier for many years. This has been a barrier actually to this day, because some of that history we may consider to be lost, that we won't be able to go back and get it because it was not captured, which has been a hard hit to the Black community and often pulls up a lot of feelings around abandonment or lostness, that they're not able to connect to a thing or a history that is actually a part of who we are, but we have no way of reaching out and getting to it, which could feel like a void or an empty hole inside of you, and it can be painful. But nonetheless, now life has kind of transitioned into this place where we have structured educational institutions, and sometimes people have become reliant on the school system to tell youth about American history or any type of history, but that is also included a reliance on them telling Black history. Now, for those of you who don't know, when I was in grammar school, they taught about Black history, but I realized quickly that the section about Black history was relatively small in comparison to all of the other history that they were teaching. Fortunately, I had a grandmother who is or was at that time a history teacher. She's now retired, but she was adamant about myself and my cousin learning about our history, and so she kind of went above and beyond to teach that. I also got that from my mother and other family members who value Black history, but nonetheless, my exposure to our history, my connection to my cultural history really didn't come from what I learned in school. And I realized that that's my story. That is not the case for many Black people in the U.S. Many Black people in the U.S. Don't have that level of connection that I've been granted to have. And so I consider it to be a blessing, but also realize that there are still some pain points that many Black people feel like are question marks for them and have been question marks, and or don't even know what the questions are that they have, knowing that there's this empty space that hasn't been filled because they have not been exposed to Black history as much. Why am I bringing all of this up? My point is we cannot rely on the educational system, an academic setting, a school to provide our children, even ourselves, with the history of our people in the same manner, with the same tenacity, with the same excitement, with the same commitment as we would if we were to do it for ourselves. So it's that same cyclical pattern. It is that same pattern that I mentioned before of if someone else is capturing our history, it may not necessarily be captured in the way that it's intended. That's not a ding on the people who was capturing it. It is instead just to recognize that this is a pure fact, that sometimes when you are not within group, these are not stories that you feel emotionally, psychologically, physically connected to in the same way as those who are, that there isn't the same oomph that comes behind it. And so I am here to make sure that you ignite that oomph within you to go and learn your history, start asking questions, start somewhere, and we can't rely on school systems in order to do it. So yes, we have to teach our own history. And now we have the world of social media, which didn't always exist. And social media has bursts into this other form of media that has a great level of influence. And when we look at the 7 spheres of influence, I think that another term for it is, I think, seven mountains theory. Okay, I probably messed that up, but definitely 7 spheres of influence is probably a real name. So go Google it, fact check me, drop it in the comments if I was right or wrong. Nonetheless, I know it's a thing, and media is one of them. Social media is a part of that pie where it has a great level of influence. Now, this could be a positive thing and it could be a negative thing. Why do I bring that up? When we use social media, we have the ability to spread information more quickly, faster, and we have a broader reach. There's pros and cons to that. Why? Because the information you put out could either be a weed or it could be a plant. Now, for those of you who are not gardeners like myself, follow along with me. I'm going to do like the beginner's level of gardening. Because I don't know that much myself. But when we look at a weed, and actually the person who first shared this analogy with me is Prophet B. Dot. She's off of, I met her on Clubhouse, but she shared this analogy of weeds and specifically dandelions. And for those of you who know what dandelions are, that's that white fuzzy weed, and they blow, when the wind blows, they kind of separate from the stem, and it essentially are seeds, and they plant in other areas of grass or wherever the seed ends up lying. Okay, now that we know what a dandelion is, we all know what plants are, produce, fruit, whatever the case may be. These are typically considered something good. So weed, bad, plants, good. Cool. Foundation has been set. When we look at weeds versus plants, I'm seeing it the same way with how we utilize social media. With information that we put out there, we can either be spreading in a quick manner and in a broad way, spreading a weed, or we could be spreading a plant. Now, the question to you is, when you spread one versus the other, how is that protecting the Black narrative? How is that uplifting our community? How is that sharing history about our community in a way that is sharing information that is needed, in a way that is to help put us in a light so that people can see who the real Black community is, and not all these other things that actually happen on a smaller scale. For example, right now in the media, any given Sunday, we can easily see something related to violence that has been tagged and connected to the Black community. Years down the line, that has been marked as history. It's present day for us, but in the future, it's history. And if we spread that more, then we push that message, which I'm going to consider to be a weed. And so what she shared about the weed versus a plant is that when weeds blow, when that dandelion blows and all those seeds blow, it grows 100 times more faster. Why? Because it's so many seeds and they blow so far away. It's very light seed, and it blows and it hits the ground on some other, area in grass, and boom, it sprouts up. And this is why we see weeds grow so much more quickly. But it takes so much more work. I mean, it literally takes no work. All you need is some wind or a kid to come and pull it up and start playing around for those seeds to land on ground. But when it comes to a plant, it doesn't happen in the same way. You have to nourish it. You've got to water it. Have to make sure it gets its proper light. You have to make sure that the seed actually sprouts, that the plant actually comes above the ground, and that the roots are healthy. There is work that it takes to protecting your plants and growing your plants so that they are healthy, so that they flourish, and so that it provides you the produce that you need. You don't have to do anything for a weed to grow. You have to do a lot of work to make sure you keep weeds out. And what's my point here? The point is there's a tendency for negativity to be shared a lot more quickly and a lot more broadly, and not necessarily the same for plants, which means we have to work so many more times to make sure that this area is flourishing and that this area is silenced and stopped. The same is to be said. There's a theory that says there's a ratio, not a theory. There's a ratio that, and I think it's a 6-to-1, that every one negative thing that is shared, you have to, negative thing that's shared, you have to share like 5 or 6 more times positive things. Did I say that right? Every one negative thing that is shared, you have to share 5 to 6 positive things to outweigh the negativity, based off of how the brain works, based off of how people receive information. But I want to go back to based off of the weeds and how they plant seeds versus how this plants the produce that we need, the fruit that we need. It's up to you. And so when we're utilizing social media, if we're talking to people, especially people outside of our community, we have to take ownership in protecting our narrative, in protecting our history, in protecting what we end up reflecting on 30 years from now. What will be considered history in the future? We have to work to protect that we are sharing more plants and produce and less weeds, and that we're working to end the weeds, because a lot of these weeds don't happen in the frequency and quantity that social media presents it as. And so if you're seeing things about your community shared that you don't like, that you disagree with, that you know not to be as true as they're trying to make it, or not true at all, it is up to you to end the weed. It is up to you to pull it up by the root and to instead nourish and plant produce and bear fruit. It's up to you. And now that's even bringing up when Jesus saw the fig tree and he cursed it because it bared no fruit. We have to be careful not to curse our community with the things that we're sharing, with the words that we speak, with the things that we speak to one another, and especially the information and the way that we portray ourselves to those who are outside of the community, especially because they do not understand. They don't know. They are not inside. And I started this off with people who are not within the community may capture information, but may not capture it in the intent in the way that it was intended. The same principle applies here. When information is received, it may not be received in the same way as it was intended, simply because that person is outside of the group. This is not to promote segregation. This isn't to promote discrimination. This isn't to promote any of those things. This is instead just speaking about pure community psychology regarding in-group and out-group principles. Take race out of it. At the end of the day, these principles still stand, and you can look it up for yourself. In-group and out-group. It is a part of community psychology. It's a part of socialism. This is how people work. That people who are in group, they have a different level of understanding because they know the history. They've experienced it for themselves. They are part of the group, versus someone who is outside of the group. They don't know the back history. And this is the same for when you're talking with your friends versus you talking with the people that you know, that are near your friends, or that are in the same workplace, or that are at the same school. That doesn't mean that they're your friends. They're in close proximity. But those who are in your friend group, they understand what's going on with one of you a little bit more because you all share information. You have a relationship with one another. You're close. And those who are outside are not. It's as simple as that. So now we add race to that, and the same principles apply. So let's not make this necessarily about race when I talk about in group and out group. I'm not saying that this is not to promote exclusion. That's not what my message is. My message is to promote bearing fruit so that we are not cursed. Bearing fruit so that we don't curse our community and we don't allow other people to curse our community. And so Jesus won't come down here one day and curse the fig tree because it's not bearing any fruit. My goodness, I refuse to have the Black community be a cursed fig tree. Now, you're probably wondering, how does this relate to our mental health? This gravely impacts our esteem, our self-esteem, or our group esteem, so to speak, our community esteem, how we feel about ourselves as Black people, not just individually, but as a group, as a community, as a society. It impacts our esteem, it impacts our pride. And so we have to work on protecting those things, because we already know that that gravely influences not only how people operate and see themselves, but even how they see their future. So when we're protecting our narrative, we're protecting more than just our story and our history. We're protecting more than just how we as individuals see ourselves. We're also protecting how we see one another and how others see us and experience us. All right, I pray that this is landing somewhere in a positive way. So with all of that being said, protect the Black narrative. You have the power to protect the Black narrative, and you don't have to live in delusion doing it. You can be honest, you can be true, but while you're being honest, maybe I shouldn't say but, and while you are being honest and true, remember how you're doing so, and that when you're using media, especially social media, you can do it quickly and you can do it on a broad spectrum, but remember that you can either be planting seeds of weed or you can be bearing fruit. Be blessed. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. Share with your community, and be sure to share with someone specific who may need to hear a little bit more about protecting the Black narrative. And of course, remember, before you go and I see you next time, if I'm great and you're great, then we're a great community.